Great Plains, 1883. While every homesteader raced to install cast iron stoves with straight pipes before winter, one Volga German settler was still building in late September. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Johann Bauer ran his stovepipe horizontally through a massive clay and stone bench along his sod house wall, 12 feet long, 2 feet high, wrapped in 8 inches of cob. Everyone else sent their heat straight up through the roof. He trapped it in 1,000 pounds of thermal mass. Elias Harper, who'd farmed in Ohio before coming west, couldn't believe anyone would warm dirt instead of air. Then January 12, 1888 arrived. The school children's blizzard hit without warning. Temperatures plunged from 30 degrees to 20 below zero in 4 hours. 40-mile-per-hour winds drove snow horizontal across the prairie. In Harper's frame cabin, breath crystallized 3 feet from his glowing stove. Water buckets froze despite burning wood all night. His family huddled in coats, struggling to keep their cabin above 25 degrees. But in Johann's sod house, children slept barefoot on that foolish bench in 68-degree air. What did this immigrant understand about heat, mass, and thermal storage that experienced American farmers had never learned? And how did his excessive bench become the difference between comfort and near freezing when the Great Plains tried to kill its settlers? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. January 12th, 1888. Outside, wind screamed across the Kansas prairie at 40 miles per hour, driving temperatures from the 20s to far below zero in a matter of hours. Inside Johann Bauer's sod house, a tin thermometer nailed to the log beam read 68 degrees. His 3 children slept peacefully on a clay bench along the north wall, their faces flushed from gentle, radiant heat despite quilts thrown loosely over their small bodies. The iron stove had been cold for hours. Its fire burned hard only at dusk, then died to coals before full dark. 200 yards east, Elias Harper's frame cabin told a different story. Breath crystallized in the air 3 feet from his glowing stove. A kettle of water beside the bed wore a thin crust of ice, and the room temperature struggled around 28 degrees despite an iron stove that had devoured split cottonwood all night. Harper pulled his wool coat tighter and fed another stick into the firebox, wondering how much longer his dwindling woodpile would last. The winter, the Great Plains tried to kill its settlers. Most families fought the cold with iron and guesswork. One man trusted what his ancestors knew about brick, clay, and moving smoke, and his bench chimney kept his family 45 degrees warmer than anyone thought possible. 5 years earlier, when Johann Bauer first walked his 160 acres of open prairie in central Kansas, he carried memories that set him apart from his American-born neighbors. As a boy in the Volga region, he had slept beside massive masonry stoves where a single evening fire heated brickwork so thoroughly that mornings still felt mild despite sub-zero temperatures outside. He had watched village craftsmen dismantle and rebuild those stoves, seen how brick flues snaked through tons of masonry, trapping heat that would otherwise fly up a chimney and disappear into the Russian winter. Now, staring at treeless grassland where sod houses and dugouts were the only practical first shelters, Johann understood that the Great Plains presented the same fundamental problem his ancestors had solved centuries earlier: how to capture and hold the heat from precious fuel when the cold tried to kill you. The conventional wisdom on frontier heating seemed simple enough. Every settler arriving in Kansas and Nebraska in the 1870s and 80s installed the same solution: a cast iron cook stove positioned near the center of the cabin with a stovepipe running straight up through the roof. The logic appeared sound, direct draft, easy installation, minimal complications. Heat blazed fierce around the stove, while the rest of the cabin remained cold, but at least smoke cleared quickly and fires burned hot. Johann had watched his neighbors through their first winter. Harper's frame cabin, built with lumber hauled from eastern Kansas, leaked heat through every joint and seam despite the man's careful workmanship. Others living in sod houses fared better with their thick earth walls, but they still fought the same losing battle, pouring wood into iron stoves that sent most of their heat straight up metal pipes and out into the night sky. The typical performance numbers told the story plainly. On bad nights when outside temperatures dropped to 10 or 20 below zero, a standard cabin with an iron stove burning through most of the night might maintain 30 to 40 degrees near the beds along outside walls. Water buckets on the floor often froze halfway through, and anyone sleeping more than 6 feet from the stove woke to frost on their quilts. Johann sketched his alternative first in the dirt beside his half-built sod house, then on a pine board with charcoal. The concept looked deceptively simple. Instead of sending hot stove gases straight up and out, why not make them work for their freedom? His design called for a bench along the north wall where winter wind hit hardest, 12 to 14 feet long, 24 inches high, 30 inches wide. Inside that bench, a 6-inch stovepipe would exit the rear of his iron stove, run 8 to 10 feet horizontally through the structure with 2 gentle bends, then turn upward into a proper chimney at the gable end. The bench itself would be built like a fortress, an inner shell of stacked fieldstone and broken brick, whatever. Materials he could gather from creek beds and abandoned foundations, then encased in 6 to 8 inches of cob, the ancient mixture of clay, sand, and chopped straw that homesteaders used for everything from chinking logs to plastering walls. When Johann explained the concept to his brother-in-law and the handful of neighbors who gathered for barn raisings and harvest help, their reactions came swift and skeptical. "Stovepipes supposed to go straight up," Harper declared with the authority of a man who had installed dozens of stoves back in Ohio. "You'll kill your draft with all those bends and that long run." Others half joked about him trying to warm his behind instead of his house, while a few expressed genuine concern that smoke would back up and smother the family in their sleep. Johann listened to their warnings without argument, but he had seen horizontal flues work for centuries in the Volga villages. The key lay in understanding that draft depended on height and temperature difference, not simply the straightness of the pipe. His chimney would still exit high above the roof peak, and hot gases would still rise. They would just surrender most of their heat to clay and stone before escaping. The construction took him 3 weeks longer than a conventional installation, working mostly alone since neighbors considered the project a waste of time. Johann began by digging the bench foundation 6 to 8 inches into the packed sod floor, filling the excavation with stones and brick fragments for stability. The rough footprint measured 14 feet by 2.5 feet, running parallel to the north wall where prairie wind drove hardest against the sod blocks. For the flue layout, Johann started with a short vertical section 18 inches off the stove, enough to establish draft before the first 90-degree elbow. The horizontal run stretched 8 feet with a 1/4-inch rise per foot toward the chimney, helping smoke and gases flow naturally upward, even through the extended path. He installed clean-out tees at the 2 lowest points with removable caps, knowing that any horizontal flue would collect ash and debris over time. The critical element was thermal mass combined with safe clearances. Johann surrounded the hot stovepipe with 3 inches of air gap and loose stones, then encased everything in 6 inches of cob, ensuring that the metal never touched combustible materials while allowing maximum heat transfer into the clay matrix. The exterior surface he smoothed with pure clay, later lime washing it to create a hard, durable finish that could withstand the daily heating and cooling cycles. Safety demanded attention to details his neighbors had never considered. A damper at the stove outlet would let him control the burn rate once the bench reached full charge, preventing overheating while maintaining steady draft. The dedicated roof exit rose high enough above the ridgeline to ensure proper draw even in the worst prairie windstorms. By late September, when other settlers were finishing their simple stove installations and preparing for winter, Johann sat on his unfinished clay bench to test its dimensions. The sight of him perched on a mound of dried mud, measuring distances with his outstretched arms while his neighbors shook their heads at weeks of extra work, would become a story told around kitchen tables for years afterward. They all agreed that a straight pipe would have done the job just fine. The first week of January 1888 brought a Chinook-like warm spell that melted snow off cabin roofs across the Great Plains and left men working in their shirt sleeves despite the calendar. Daytime temperatures climbed into the 20s and even low 30s, convincing many settlers that winter's back had been broken early. Children walked miles to school without heavy furs. Parents let fires die out at night to conserve their dwindling wood supplies. And more than one neighbor made pointed comments to Johann about all that extra mud and pipe work for a cold snap that was already ending. But Johann had seen Russian winters turn like a knife blade, and he kept his bench charged and his woodpile stacked high. Every evening through those deceptively mild days, he maintained his ritual of lighting a single hot fire in late afternoon, feeding 2 to 3 armloads of split cottonwood into his iron stove, perhaps 1/3 of a cubic foot of dense wood per firing. The fire burned hard for exactly 2 hours, sending exhaust gases at 600 to 800 degrees into the horizontal pipe, before they entered the bench cavity and began surrendering their heat to 1,000 pounds of clay and stone. The thermal dynamics unfolded exactly as Johann remembered from his boyhood. The cob bench, weighing roughly 1,500 pounds when fully cured, absorbed the intense heat like a massive battery. Temperature at the bench surface climbed from its resting point around 40 degrees to 110 degrees near the stove outlet, then settled to a steady 85 to 90 degrees along most of the seating area. Room air temperature rose steadily through the evening hours, stabilizing around 62 to 68 degrees by 9 or 10 o'clock, even as the fire died to coals and then cold ash. The real proof came at dawn. Without any additional firing through the night, Johann's sod house maintained 50 to 55 degrees in the main room, while the bench still radiated gentle warmth, enough that his children's quilts stayed flexible instead of frozen stiff. Meanwhile, Elias Harper and other neighbors following conventional practice had to feed their stoves 3 or 4 times between sunset and sunrise just to keep their cabins above freezing. If Harper let his fire die at 2 in the morning, his frame cabin dropped to 25 or 30 degrees by dawn, with ice forming on water buckets and frost coating the inside of windows. The Yamam, social friction intensified as Johann's fuel consumption became impossible to ignore. At the community well, outside the small church after Sunday services, and in the general store on supply runs, neighbors made increasingly pointed observations about his heating methods. Harper, whose authority rested on successful farming experience back in Ohio, called the bench chimney a Russian contraption and half-baked foreign nonsense that wastes good stove heat-warming dirt instead of the room. The local blacksmith, who supplemented his income installing and repairing stoves, quoted unnamed experts who insisted that horizontal stovepipes created dangerous smoke problems and excessive creosote buildup. Johann responded to their criticism with numbers rather than arguments. He pointed out that every extra foot of hot pipe inside the house meant 1 less foot of cold pipe outside, bleeding heat into the winter air. When pressed about efficiency, he quietly noted that his woodpile was dropping at roughly 1 cord per month, while Harper burned through 3 cords in the same period to achieve inferior results. These figures aligned with documented performance differences between masonry heaters and conventional stoves, though Johann's neighbors had no frame of reference for such comparisons. The criticism stung because it carried the weight of community consensus. American frontier culture in the 1880s valued practical innovation, but it also demanded that new ideas prove themselves quickly and obviously. Johann's bench chimney violated accepted wisdom about stove installation while requiring weeks of extra labor for benefits that seemed marginal during mild weather. Even neighbors who acknowledged his lower wood consumption suggested he was simply lucky to have found better seasoned fuel or a more sheltered location for his sod house. Behind the skepticism lay deeper cultural tensions. Johann represented a wave of European immigrants who brought old world techniques that often conflicted with established American methods. His bench chimney embodied centuries of peasant engineering developed in harsh climates, but to his neighbors, it looked like stubborn adherence to foreign ways when simpler American solutions already existed. The fact that his approach required specialized knowledge about thermal mass, flue dynamics, and masonry construction made it seem impractical for typical frontier families who needed heating systems they could install and maintain without expert help. As January progressed and the warm weather held, Johann found himself increasingly isolated in his conviction that severe cold was still coming. Meteorological science in 1888 lacked the tools to predict rapid weather changes, and frontier communities relied on folk wisdom, animal behavior, and sky reading to anticipate storms. Most settlers interpreted the mild spell as evidence that they had survived winter's worst challenges, making Johann's continued preparations look like the anxious behavior of someone who didn't understand American weather patterns. The community's confidence rested on recent experience. The winter of 1886 to 1887 had been relatively mild across Kansas and Nebraska, reinforcing the belief that the harsh winters of the 1870s were historical aberrations rather than recurring threats. Families who had struggled through their first plains winter now felt seasoned and competent, trusting their iron stoves and straight stovepipes as proven technology that had carried them through previous cold snaps. Johann's isolation deepened when he continued firing his bench every evening despite the warm days. Neighbors observed his smoke rising at sunset and shook their heads at the waste of good fuel when cabins stayed comfortable without heat. Some suggested that his foreign upbringing had left him unable to judge American climate, while others wondered if the elaborate bench system had become an obsession that prevented him from recognizing changing conditions. But Johann had learned to read prairie weather through 5 winters of careful observation, and he recognized signs that his American-born neighbors missed or dismissed. Wind patterns shifting from southwest to northwest, high, thin clouds moving in contrary directions, and the particular quality of light that preceded major storms all suggested that the mild spell was temporary. More importantly, his memories of Russian winters included sudden temperature drops that could kill unprepared families in a matter of hours. On the evening of January 11th, as neighbors left their barn doors open and children played outside in light jackets, Johann charged his bench more thoroughly than usual. He fed his stove with a half-day's worth of split wood in one intense 2-hour burn, pushing surface temperatures along the hottest section up to 120 degrees while keeping the cob shell safely below scorching. By the time he dampered down the flue and prepared for bed, his thermal mass held enough stored heat to warm the house for days without additional firing. That night, while his neighbors slept comfortably in unheated cabins, counting on the mild weather to continue, Johann checked his rope anchor points, organized emergency supplies, and made sure his axe and shovel were within easy reach. He had seen winters turn without warning, and he knew that tomorrow might test every heating system on the Great Plains. The morning of January 12th broke hazy and deceptively calm, with temperatures still hovering near freezing despite a subtle shift in wind direction that made Johann check his weather signs twice before heading to the barn. By 10 o'clock, high cirrus clouds had thickened into an iron-gray ceiling, and the northwest wind began to build with the particular steady intensity that preceded major storms on the Great Plains. Johann recognized the pattern from 5 winters of careful observation and immediately began his crisis preparations, firing his stove harder than usual while his neighbors continued their morning routines, trusting the mild weather to hold. The temperature collapse began just after noon with a violence that caught even experienced settlers off guard. In less than 4 hours, thermometers dropped from 32 degrees to near zero, then continued falling as afternoon gave way to early darkness. The wind built to a sustained 40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the prairie in sheets so thick that visibility disappeared beyond arm's length. By 4 o'clock, effective wind chill had reached 40 degrees below zero, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. Inside Johann's sod house, the crisis preparations unfolded according to a plan refined over years of watching European winters kill the unprepared. He and his eldest son fed their iron stove with a half-day's worth of fuel in a single 3-hour burn, deliberately overcharging the bench mass to maximum safe capacity. Surface temperatures along the hottest section climbed to 120 degrees, while the surrounding cob shell remained cool enough to touch, a testament to the thermal properties of properly mixed clay and straw. The massive heat absorption created a reservoir of warmth that would sustain the house through the worst of the storm without requiring additional fuel or risking dangerous overheating. The technical performance gap between Johann's system and conventional heating became brutally apparent as night fell and outside temperatures reached 15 below zero with hurricane-force wind. In Elias Harper's frame, cabin 200 yards east, the iron stove glowed cherry red from constant feeding, but vicious drafts pulled most of the heat straight up the chimney and out into the storm. Despite burning wood continuously, Harper's main room struggled to maintain 25 degrees, with ice forming on the inside walls and water buckets near the door freezing solid within hours. His family kept their coats and boots on indoors, huddling within 6 feet of the stove, while the outer edges of the cabin radiated cold like the inside of an ice house. Johann's sod house presented a completely different thermal environment. The 3-foot-thick earth walls muted the wind to a distant whisper, while the bench and surrounding masonry radiated steady heat throughout the night. Even after the stove fire died to cold ash around 8 o'clock, interior air temperature held steady in the 65 to 70 degree range, with the bench surface maintaining a comfortable 90 to 100 degrees along most of its length. His children slept soundly on quilts spread directly over the warm clay, their faces relaxed and bodies completely at ease despite the howling storm just inches away beyond the sod blocks. The difference between survival and near death became measurable in precise numbers. Johann's interior maintained 70 degrees while Harper's cabin struggled at 25 degrees, a gap of 45 degrees that represented the margin between comfort and hypothermia. More critically, Johann's system achieved this performance using stored heat from a single afternoon firing, while Harper burned wood continuously through the night and still could not prevent ice formation on his interior walls. As the storm intensified past midnight, the broader community began to fracture under thermal stress that exposed the limitations of conventional frontier heating. Anna Larson, the schoolteacher who lived in a thin-walled frame shanty a quarter-mile south, watched her room temperature drop toward 30 degrees despite keeping her stove door cracked open to maximize heat output. The strategy backfired by creating dangerous draft conditions that sent most of her precious fuel straight up the chimney while filling the cabin with smoke that forced her to choose between warmth and breathable air. An older widower named Henrik Olsen, living in a marginal sod hut with a dangerously low woodpile, made the decision that would save his life when he saw lamplight glowing through Johann's windows during a brief break in the whiteout conditions. Word had spread among the children during autumn visits that Johann's house stayed warm enough to sit barefoot on clay benches while adults talked, a detail that seemed impossible until the night when impossible became the difference between freezing and surviving. Johann's response to the crisis demonstrated both the power of his system and his understanding of community obligations that transcended individual survival. When neighbors began appearing at his door through the storm, he opened his home without hesitation, knowing that his thermal mass could absorb additional body heat while maintaining comfortable temperatures. The bench design proved perfectly suited for emergency shelter, with its broad, warm surface capable of supporting multiple people wrapped in quilts, while the surrounding air remained breathable and comfortable. The rescue operations required careful management of limited resources and deep understanding of how thermal mass systems respond to changing loads. Johann decided against lighting additional fires that might overwhelm his flue system or create dangerous overheating, trusting instead the massive heat reservoir he had charged during the afternoon. He positioned the most severely chilled refugees directly on the bench, backs against the warm cob, where surface temperatures of 90 to 100 degrees provided therapeutic warming without risk of burns. The clay held its heat so consistently that people could rest comfortably against it for hours, while their core body temperatures recovered from dangerous lows. By midnight, Johann's sod house sheltered 3 neighboring families in addition to his own, with interior conditions that seemed impossible given the raging storm outside. The stove had been cold for 4 hours, yet air temperature held at 62 degrees while the bench continued radiating gentle warmth. Children who had arrived with blue lips and stiff fingers were sleeping peacefully on the clay surface. Their color returned to normal pink, and their breathing deep and regular. Outside, the wind continued to scream across the prairie at sustained speeds that made survival in the open impossible for more than minutes. The thermal performance that night established benchmarks that would be remembered and referenced for decades among Great Plains settlers who survived the schoolchildren's blizzard. While conventional heating systems failed catastrophically across the region, leaving families to choose between burning furniture and facing hypothermia. Johann's bench chimney maintained comfortable living conditions using only the heat stored from a single afternoon firing. The contrast between his 70-degree interior and the sub-zero chaos outside represented more than technical superiority, it demonstrated the life or death importance of understanding how heat moves through mass, how thermal storage works, and why centuries of European peasant engineering had developed solutions that American frontier culture had dismissed as unnecessary foreign complications. Dawn on January 13th revealed a transformed landscape where snowdrifts reached second-story windows, and the silence following the storm's passage felt almost unnatural after 12 hours of howling wind. Across the Great Plains, the schoolchildren's blizzard had claimed 235 lives, most of them children and teachers caught in the open when temperatures plummeted without warning. But in the cluster of homesteads around Johann's settlement, the accounting would tell a different story, one measured in degrees of warmth rather than degrees of cold. Johann emerged from his sod house into air so sharp it burned his lungs, the thermometer on his doorframe reading 22 below zero in the still morning air. Inside, his guests were stirring on quilts spread across the bench, their faces showing the healthy flush of people who had slept warm despite surviving a killer storm. The tin thermometer on his interior wall read 54 degrees at 7 in the morning, a full day after his last fire, while the bench surface still radiated enough heat that children could sit on it comfortably, in bare feet. The survey of neighboring homesteads began as soon as paths could be dug through the drifts, and the results provided stark numerical evidence of what the community had learned about heating systems during the worst night of winter. Elias Harper's frame cabin told the story in ice formations and frozen household goods. Despite burning wood continuously for 14 hours, his interior had never climbed above 30 degrees, leaving a crust of ice on the water bucket beside his bed and frost coating the inside. Surfaces of his windows. His family had survived by huddling around the stove in every piece of clothing they owned, taking shifts to feed the fire and prevent the room temperature from dropping to lethal levels. Anna Larson's shanty presented even grimmer evidence of conventional heating failures. Her thin walls and straight stovepipe had proven completely inadequate against the storm's fury, forcing her to make dangerous compromises between heat and safety. She had cracked her stove door open to maximize radiant heating, filling her small space with smoke and carbon monoxide while still failing to prevent ice from forming on her washwater. Only the arrival of Henrik Olsen, who had helped her reach Johann's house during the worst of the blizzard, had prevented serious frostbite on her hands and feet. The measurable differences in thermal performance told a story that even the most skeptical neighbors could not dismiss. Johann's house had maintained an average air temperature 25 degrees warmer than Harper's cabin and nearly 30 degrees warmer than Anna's shanty. More significantly, the primary sleeping area on his bench had stayed 45 degrees warmer than the beds in conventional cabins, where families had wakened to find their quilts stiff with frost and their breath visible in the pale morning light. Wood consumption during the crisis provided equally dramatic evidence of efficiency differences that aligned perfectly with documented masonry heater performance. Johann had used approximately 1/8 cord of split cottonwood during the main storm period, burned in a single intense firing that charged his thermal mass for the entire night. Harper, by contrast, had consumed nearly half a cord of the same wood while achieving inferior results, feeding his iron stove every 2 to 3 hours in a desperate attempt to maintain marginal heating. The 4-to-1 efficiency advantage represented exactly the kind of fuel savings that European peasant families had relied upon during centuries of harsh winters with limited wood supplies. Health outcomes in the immediate settlement area reflected the thermal differences with medical precision that would have impressed frontier doctors had any been available to document the cases. In Johann's house, none of his own family members or refugee neighbors suffered frostbite injuries, despite several people arriving with dangerous symptoms of hypothermia. The gentle, sustained heat from the bench had allowed gradual rewarming without the shock of extreme temperature changes that could damage tissue or strain hearts. Harper's family and other conventional heating households told a different story. Harper's youngest son showed clear signs of frostbite on his toes, from sleeping against the cold floor near exterior walls, while his wife had partial freezing damage on her fingertips from tending their iron stove through the night. Anna Larson arrived at Johann's house with her feet so cold. They had lost feeling, a condition that required careful warming on the clay bench over several hours before circulation fully returned. The community realization unfolded gradually over the 3 days required to dig out from the storm and restore normal movement between homesteads. Neighbors who had dismissed Johann's bench chimney as wasteful foreign nonsense found themselves asking detailed questions about construction techniques, thermal mass principles, and fuel consumption patterns. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. His system had outperformed every conventional heating method by margins that meant the difference between comfort and survival. Elias Harper, whose criticism of the horizontal stovepipe had been particularly vocal, became the most persistent questioner about specific construction details. He examined the bench structure with the careful attention of a man whose confidence in his own expertise had been shaken by objective results. Running his hands over the smooth clay surface that still radiated warmth 36 hours after the last fire, Harper admitted quietly that he had never seen heat stored so effectively in any system he had installed or used. The technical questions focused on practical concerns that reflected genuine interest in adoption rather than idle curiosity. How much clay and straw were required for proper cob mixture? What internal clearances prevented dangerous overheating while maximizing heat transfer? How did the horizontal flue maintain adequate draft without creating smoke problems? Johann answered with the patience of a man whose methods had been vindicated by the harshest possible test, explaining construction details as carefully as he had once learned them from village craftsmen in the Volga region. Carl Schmidt, the local blacksmith who supplemented his income with stove installations, examined the flue routing and masonry work with professional interest that transcended personal skepticism. He traced the path of the stovepipe through the bench, noting the clean-out access points and the careful attention to thermal expansion that prevented cracking in the clay shell. Schmidt's questions revealed genuine respect for engineering principles that he had initially dismissed as primitive, and his growing enthusiasm suggested that the bench chimney concept might find its way into future installations throughout the settlement. The broader implications began to emerge as neighbors calculated the wood savings they might achieve with similar systems. Johann's 1 cord per month consumption compared to Harper's 3 cord requirement represented savings that could mean the difference between adequate fuel supplies and dangerous shortages during extended cold periods. For families struggling to cut and haul sufficient wood from increasingly distant timber claims, the efficiency advantage offered by thermal mass heating could determine whether they survived their second or third winter on the Sisisart, Great Plains. The social transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Johann's position in the community shifted from that of stubborn immigrant clinging to foreign ways to practical innovator whose old country knowledge had solved New World problems. The bench that neighbors had mocked as warming dirt instead of air was now recognized as a sophisticated heat storage system that had kept his family comfortable when conventional heating had nearly failed entirely. By the spring of 1889, 2 neighbors had approached Johann with requests for help building shortened versions of his bench chimney, their skepticism transformed into practical interest by a winter that had tested every heating system to its limits. Elias Harper led the adoptions, designing an 8-foot bench along the south wall of his frame cabin, where morning sun could supplement the stored heat from his evening fires. His version relied more heavily on field stone than cob, using materials readily available from creek beds and fence line clearings, but the principle remained identical: capture the heat before it escaped up the chimney. Anna Larson commissioned Carl Schmidt to build a hybrid system that combined her existing iron stove with a smaller thermal mass platform positioned where her bed had frozen during the blizzard. Schmidt's design incorporated broken brick, salvaged from an abandoned homestead foundation, surrounded by traditional cob mixture, but finished with a lime plaster surface that dried harder and more durable than raw clay. The result was a compact heating bench that could warm her small shanty through the night with a single evening firing, ending her dangerous practice of keeping the stove door cracked open during severe weather. The construction technique spread through informal knowledge sharing rather than formal instruction, as neighbors helped each other adapt the basic concept to their specific buildings and available materials. A Swedish immigrant named Eric Lindqvist experimented with incorporating fragments of ceramic tile into his bench core, drawing on memories of Kakaloon stoves from his childhood in Värmland. His hybrid design combined the horizontal flue concept with traditional Scandinavian tile stove principles, creating a system that could store even more heat per unit of fuel than Johann's original clay bench. Rule of thumb knowledge began to crystallize around practical guidelines that could be applied by homesteaders without specialized masonry skills. The emerging wisdom emphasized making walls thick, benches heavy, and fires intense but brief, principles that aligned perfectly with centuries-old European approaches to domestic heating. Families started talking about charging the bench as casually as they discussed milking cows or feeding chickens, incorporating thermal mass management into their daily routines with the same attention they paid to other survival tasks. Schmidt's blacksmith shop became an unofficial center for bench chimney development as word spread to neighboring townships and county seats. Farmers arriving for equipment repairs brought questions about horizontal flues, thermal mass calculations, and safe clearances for hot stovepipes running through combustible materials. Schmidt responded by developing standardized components, pre-bent pipe sections, clean-out tees, and damper assemblies that made bench construction more accessible to families without extensive metalworking skills. The local adoption pattern reflected broader immigration trends as European settlers throughout Kansas and Nebraska began recognizing opportunities to apply Old World heating knowledge to New World challenges. A community of Volga Germans near Hayes implemented bench heating in their church and school, creating shared thermal mass systems that could warm large gatherings with minimal fuel consumption. Scandinavian settlements in Saline and McPherson counties developed their own variations, often incorporating decorative tile work that transformed functional heating benches into attractive furniture pieces. By 1891, Schmidt was advertising Russian-style stoves and German heaters in the weekly papers of 3 counties, offering installation services and prefabricated components to homesteaders who wanted bench heating without the trial-and-error process of independent construction. His advertisements emphasized fuel savings and winter comfort rather than technical specifications, appealing to practical concerns that resonated with families who had survived their own heating crises during severe weather. The technical understanding that emerged from this grassroots adoption revealed why Johann's system had worked so effectively during the blizzard. Heavy materials like brick, stone, and clay could absorb enormous amounts of heat energy and release it slowly over many hours, creating thermal batteries that continued warming rooms long after fires died out. A thin iron stove, by contrast, heated quickly but cooled just as fast, requiring constant fuel input to maintain comfortable temperatures and wasting most of its energy by sending hot gases directly up the chimney. The horizontal flue concept maximized contact time between hot exhaust gases and thermal mass, allowing efficient heat transfer that conventional straight pipes could never achieve. This principle operated identically in Russian stoves, Chinese Kang bed stoves, and European masonry heaters, all systems developed independently by cultures that faced harsh winters with limited fuel supplies. Johann's bench simply adapted these ancient solutions to Great Plains conditions, using sod house insulation and prairie materials to create a heating system optimized for frontier survival. Energy accounting provided compelling evidence for families considering the investment required for bench construction. If a conventional cabin required 3 cords of wood to barely maintain, above freezing temperatures during a hard month, while a bench-heated house used only 1 cord to sustain 60 to 70 degrees most evenings, the fuel savings alone justified the extra construction time and materials. For homesteaders struggling to cut and haul adequate firewood from increasingly distant timber sources, thermal mass heating could determine whether they survived extended cold periods or faced life-threatening fuel shortages. The documentation of these heating innovations remained largely informal, preserved in letters, diaries, and oral traditions rather than technical manuals or architectural pattern books. But the practical knowledge spread steadily through kinship networks, church communities, and ethnic associations that connected European immigrants across the expanding frontier. A successful bench chimney in one settlement often inspired similar construction in related communities hundreds of miles away, as families shared detailed instructions through correspondence and visiting relatives. Local museums in later decades would struggle to reconstruct the full story of these heating adaptations, as many sod houses collapsed or were demolished when families built more permanent frame and stone homes. But the principle survived in modified forms as immigrants carried thermal mass concepts into their upgraded dwellings, incorporating small masonry heaters, tile stoves, and heated sleeping alcoves into more conventional American house designs. The broader pattern reflected a fundamental truth about frontier adaptation that extended far beyond heating systems. Immigrant families who successfully combined Old World knowledge with New World conditions often developed solutions that outperform both traditional European methods and standard American practices. Johann's bench chimney represented exactly this kind of synthetic innovation, neither purely Russian nor purely American, but a hybrid system optimized for Great Plains winters that European ancestors had never experienced. By the mid-1890s, the sight of horizontal stovepipes and clay benches had become unremarkable in European immigrant settlements throughout central Kansas and southern Nebraska. What neighbors had once mocked as foreign foolishness was now recognized as practical engineering that solved real problems with measurable results. The transformation from ridicule to acceptance had required only one brutal winter and the undeniable evidence of families sleeping warm while others nearly froze to death just yards away. On the frontier, the man who let the neighbors laugh and built for the worst cold using the old ways of stone, clay, and slow-stored heat was the man whose children slept warm when the blizzard came. Everyone mocked his bench chimney right up until the night that bench was 45 degrees warmer than the beds they nearly froze to death in.